Well, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me all right? All right, we were fiddling a little bit with some of the electronics. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Well, I'm so excited to be back here in Livonia. You guys are very welcoming. This is kind of where I got a bit of my start in the lecturing trade. I am a historian by training, and right now actually a bookmobiler by trade. So I run the bookmobile up in St. Clair County, working for the library. But the thing about museums and libraries is you never do them if you have a lust for money and power. So I have a wonderfully fun kind of side hustle in getting to speak at libraries all over the state, and I get to speak about some of my favorite topics. And I've written a couple dozen different lectures on different topics, but especially November. You get a night like this where the gales whip up, as they were, and people are always kind of interested in shipwrecks. And one of those other topics that people always request lots of lectures on is the history of Michigan. And so I thought I would do my best to what could be a novel approach, because I know a lot of the other lecturers in the state. I'm good friends with some of them. My buddy Rick Mixter, he's a professional diver. He's been in submarines on the wrecks. I am far too buoyant to go underwater. That's not me. So I was like, what angle can I bring to this? And what I thought was combining these two really interesting topics. So we're going to talk about the history of the state of Michigan, give you this kind of 30,000-foot survey of the history of the state, and do that through looking at a number of different shipwrecks and what they can tell us about the history of our really cool state. So we got a lot of history to cover. As you're going to see from my first slide, we're going to start at the very beginning, because there ain't no Great Lakes if you go back far enough, right? So you come back, 50, 60,000 years, and Michigan is covered by a mile of ice. You don't have any shipwrecks because you have the Laurentide ice sheet that's going to actually gouge out our wonderful Great Lakes, right? So all of the Great Lakes dug out by these glaciers, and that's why we would see so many shipwrecks, is because we have these amazing lakes. So the very first people to call Michigan home were, of course, the indigenous people here. And there have been a number of different indigenous people who have called different parts of Michigan home at different times. By and large, the largest groups, and one of the largest groups that's still here today, is the Anishinaabe. So that's groups like the Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and there's kind of different pronunciations for some of those. So sometimes you hear Ottawa, Odawa, different ways of pronouncing the same words. But like I said, they've been here since time immemorial. One of my favorite pictures, I use this one in a lot of my slideshows. This is actually a depiction taken up in Mackinac of a couple of Odawa guys. I like this one because, I love the clothing they're wearing is this really interesting mix of both indigenous-inspired design with French elements in there. This guy's got a real cool looking top hat. But I really like this one, especially because they are standing in front of Michigan's first ships of any kind, our first watercraft, and it is the canoe. The birch bark canoe is actually an indigenous invention. So that's something that's really cool. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can make one of those out of birch bark, sew that together with spruce root, pine pitch, and seal it with that pine pitch, a little bit of tar, and that'll be waterproof. You can use one of those years after year after year, and they're quite lightweight. There are other canoes as well, these dugout canoes where you're literally burning or gouging out the center of a log, and one of those is going to be very, very heavy, but again, will last a very long time. Every once in a while, they dig one of those up out of a pond somewhere and date it to thousands of years ago. But even after the Europeans arrived, they realized one of the best ways to get around in the state of Michigan was by water, and they found the best craft to do that in was the canoe. And so they would actually ask, there were large canoe factories here in Michigan. They were making canoes for people in Montreal, in Quebec, all throughout the 18th century. They would make these canoes, oh, that's kind of fun. They were making these canoes sometimes upwards of 36, 40 feet long, capable of carrying up to 3 tons of trade goods. Now, one of the interesting things, we know the Europeans obviously have a lot of sailing technology. They would even sometimes add a big sail to one of these canoes. They don't have a keel really to speak of, so they can't tack back and forth or anything like that. But if the wind's blowing in the direction that you're paddling, that's going to save you a lot of work. So the very first Europeans, and we've kind of already talked about that first major milestone in Michigan recorded history, is the arrival of Europeans in the 17th century. The first Europeans to get here are, of course, French. You have people like Jean Nicolet and Etienne Brulé. These are guys who are paddling through the Great Lakes and through the straits, heading west, all the way back like 1615. So this is the 1615, that's 5 years before the Pilgrims would land at Plymouth Rock. The French are already here in the Great Lakes. So there's a lot of history here. Well, he was taking a look, trying to find a shortcut to Asia, as many of the Europeans were, hoping to meet up with the Emperor of China. In fact, Jean Nicolet, when he would paddle through, would even bring a nice silk Chinese robe. And he kind of realized he wasn't in China, but he said, well, I brought it, I might as well wear it, right? And he put it on to meet some of the native people all the way on the other side of the Great Lakes. And when he passed through, although he didn't find that shortcut to Asia, what he did find was a lot of fur-bearing animals. And this is what was going to set off the economy for Michigan for the next couple hundred years, because cute little beavers like that can turn into cute little hats like that, right? So hats like this, very, very expensive, something that was, you don't think about this a lot today. How many of you today in the audience own a hat? Right? It's everybody, right? I would assume almost all of us own a hat of some description. How many of you, if you've done any estate planning, know in your will who your hat is going to go to? Right? This is something you see in the 18th century a lot, though. That is something that gets mentioned specifically. Today, yeah, you'd be hard-pressed to see the will where someone specifically says who's getting, what hat, right? But these beaver fur hats, although this kind is, your typical George Washington kind of tri-corner hat, very popular in the colonial period, you can make them into all different shapes. I mean, I wore a fur felt hat today from the 40s here. So they still make these different shapes, but some of the best material and very, very valuable. To give you an idea just how valuable that is, this is John Jacob Astor. Astor would found the American Fur Company that would be headquartered up on Mackinac Island in the beginning of the 19th century. That's him looking very Roman over there on this coin or medallion for trade. And many of you have probably heard the name John Jacob Astor. But most of you, I imagine, are probably thinking of this John Jacob Astor. This is John Jacob Astor IV. And what is he most famous for? Anybody know? He went down on the Titanic. Yeah, he was the richest guy on the Titanic. So that should tell you something, that if your great-grandson you've made generational wealth in that fur trade, that your great-grandson will become famous for going down on a boat full of rich people as the richest person on there. That should give you an indication of just how much money is available in that fur trade. So a little bit later on, this is one of the reasons, I know we haven't gotten any shipwrecks yet, but that's because there haven't been any ships. Everyone's getting around on these canoes, and the canoe is really convenient at the end of the night when you're paddling, you just pull it up on shore. Anywhere you can hop out, you can get on shore, you're going to nest your canoe, you're not going to worry about that. There's very few people who would go out of the sight of land in the canoe. Occasionally you would see some of the Odawa were actually known for that. They'd cut straight across Lake Michigan. It'd take about 2 days. But yeah, that means the middle of that first night while you're out paddling, you're in the middle. You better hope that the weather stays pretty nice. That'd be pretty scary, in fact, to do something like that. But the French are really interested in sailing on the Great Lakes, but there's a huge problem that people like Mr. LaSalle here would find. In fact, by the very early part of the 17th century, they found the difficulty. They could sail the boat over from France, they can get up the St. Lawrence River, and then they're going to run into this. What do they run into? Niagara Falls, right? There's some really interesting depictions of Niagara Falls, some maybe very enthusiastic, let's say, woodcuts here with little tiny people. I mean, they're big waterfalls. I don't know if maybe they're that big, but these enormous waterfalls were a very difficult problem because the problem is you can't sail up Niagara Falls, and you can only sail over it once. So this is going to be a huge impediment for Europeans coming onto the Great Lakes. So their only solution is if you want to sail on the Great Lakes, you have to build the ship you're going to sail with on top of the Niagara Escarpment. You have to build it up into the Great Lakes. And so that's what they would finally do by 1679. On Cayuga Island, they built a ship called Le Griffin in 1679. Now, for those of you who may not speak French, that is French for the Griffin. And the Griffin was built as this sailing bark that could ply the Great Lakes up on top of the waterfall there. I love this drawing. this kind of artwork here. It reeks to me, there's guys chopping down trees, people working on the thing. They look a little big. The ship looks maybe a little small for the size of the people working on it. But you could definitely tell this was basically built in Buffalo, New York. And I don't know if anybody's been to Buffalo. There aren't necessarily like these huge, majestic, like El Capitan mountains. And there certainly aren't a lot of palm trees, at least last time I was in Buffalo. So this is somebody who has described the situation to an artist back in Europe who's making it maybe a little fanciful. And that's the thing about the Griffin. The first sailing ship in the Great Lakes, we don't really know what it looked like. We have a couple of written descriptions, but none of them are exactly the same. Some of them change depending on who they're writing to. If they said, if they're writing the tax assessor, it was very small. If they're writing the insurance company afterwards, it was huge. The claim needs to be so much bigger. So it really could vary. We have a couple of different depictions of that. But what the plan was, they built this on Lake Erie to launch through Lake Erie and to go all the way over through the lower Great Lakes, up the Detroit River, into Lake St. Clair, up the St. Clair River, and into Lake Huron, and over to Lake Michigan. And so that's what they did. In 1679, this was a very difficult trip to make because we've all heard the expression uncharted waters. These were quite literally uncharted waters. If you're in a canoe, it doesn't really matter how deep the lake is. Like, can your canoe fit? Then you're fine. No one had worried about sandbars or anything like that, which they're going to actually start encountering with a sailing ship. So on this first trip, they planned it out meticulously. They sent out a number of canoes prior to the sailboat so they could be in different positions in case they needed help anywhere along their proposed route. In fact, they got held up in Port Huron for about 5 days right underneath the Blue Water Bridge, that area they called the Rapids. There's such a strong current there. It's one of the strongest currents anywhere in the Great Lakes. And if the wind wasn't blowing at their back, they just couldn't make it up there. So they had to camp out in Port Huron for a few days in the summer of 1679 in September, waiting for the wind to blow them and carry them up into Lake Huron. But they did eventually make their destination. They got all the way to Green Bay, Wisconsin. So this is where they were headed. They got to Green Bay. They had stockpiled a huge number of furs from the previous winter to ship back, because that's, again, the big trade item. And they left a skeleton crew, just a couple of men on board, 8 or 9 men to sail the boat, and everyone else wintered over, and were going to look for other routes further west to see if maybe there was a good river or another connection they could make that way. And in September of 1679, when Le Griffin leaves Green Bay, we enter unsolved mysteries territory, because we don't know what happened to it. So this is our first big shipwreck, right? It looms large in our collective consciousness, but we don't know what could have happened to the Griffin. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. Could have been a big storm. Every couple of years, how many of you, I imagine many of you are avid shipwreck fans, as morbid as that may sound, but it's kind of a self-selecting group for a lecture like this. How many of you have ever heard of someone making the claim that they found the Griffin? It happens every few years, right? Somebody's like, oh, we found it. We just need your money, right? To go dig it up or something like that, or there's some kind of Canadian fee or something they have to pay. I don't want to sound too cynical, but I would just highly doubt they're ever going to find it, because we have no idea where it could have disappeared or exactly what happened to it. Could have hit any of these uncharted reefs or rocks on the way back. It could have just been a big storm that swamped it. Sailing on the Great Lakes is not easy. In some ways, it's even harder than out on the ocean. There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the Great Lakes. My personal pet theory that I lent a lot of credence to is there was a suggestion that this small number of crew members who are essentially transporting what would have been like a Brinks truck back then. It's a lifetime of fortunes with the number of furs they packed on board. They could have just taken them and burned the boat and just said, we're going to steal all these and go take a different route back to Quebec, and we've made our fortune. That's what a lot of the French had come here to the New World to do. But as far as finding it today, it would be very difficult to identify. Since we don't know the size, we don't know the design, we don't know where it sank, you'd have to find one of the cannons and maybe a note in a bottle that said this is definitely the Griffin, here's what happened. And the odds of that are incredibly small. But it is kind of a good one to start with, because it is one of these true mysteries. Now, the fur trade would continue in Michigan. That would be sparked off by this, even with the failure of the Griffin sinking. This is one of my absolute favorite maps anywhere in the world. And I always take the opportunity, especially in a setting like this, I can always feel like, you know, a general here when it's really big behind me. But I love this map because this depicts North America in the middle of the 18th century. And there's a little insert up here that shows you New Orleans. But what's neat about this is Michigan is kind of in the dead center of this map, which really shows you just how important it was. The way the fur trade would work, like I said, bears going into just a little bit because it would dominate Michigan's economy for such a long time. The big French ships would come in to the St. Lawrence here. They'd head all the way down to Quebec and Montreal. There's Quebec, there's Montreal. And as we know, they can't really get too much further than that. And so to get into the interior with the trade goods that they're bringing to get the furs, because the furs are all out here around the Great Lakes, they would put all of these trade goods onto canoes from the big ships, and they'd head up like the French and Ottawa River into the Mattawa River and over here into Georgian Bay. That's one route. You could go the lower route as well, depending exactly where you were going. But this trip from Montreal here to Mackinac or here down to Detroit in Michigan would take about a month. And you're doing that with 3 tons of trade goods and a dozen other Frenchmen paddling a canoe with you. That's pretty fast to move over 1,000 miles. I think you'd be hard-pressed to do that well today, considering the number of trade goods that they're carrying with them. And when we say trade goods, there's all sorts of things that they're bringing in to Michigan. So if you were a fur trader, if you were, say, a native person out harvesting furs and you had a great big bundle of furs you trapped all winter, what item would you be most excited to buy that the Europeans might bring in? Any guesses? Gunpowder, tools, knives, alcohol. Actually, about 2/3 of the trade goods were textiles. Who just wants a wool coat for the winter, right? So textiles made up about 2/3 of all of those trade goods coming through. But they would all be exchanged here in Michigan, and the furs would make their way back. And this would drive the economy for well over a century. You know, we associate Michigan with cars, of course, today. Michigan was associated with the fur trade for much longer than we've been associated with the auto industry, which is pretty wild to think about it when you think about it that way. But let's talk a little bit about the political situation as well. This is what things looked like in the middle of the 18th century. So we've made a pretty big jump in time. All of this area is claimed by France politically, although there are actually very few Frenchmen who are living here. Excuse me. In fact, in all of Quebec, there's something like 80,000 Frenchmen, and in all of the 13 colonies, you got about 3 million people. So there's a whole order of magnitude difference in terms of just how many people are living out in this backcountry, the PDO as they would call it. And there are some things that are kind of forever a little bit of a mystery. It's one of the things I always like about history. Even though as a historian, it is my job to tell you about the past, some things we just don't know. And it seems inevitable that when you have, the French in blue, the British in red, they don't like each other, that somewhere these two empires are going to come into conflict over this kind of disputed territory. And the real mystery is that conflict would happen right here. Why two empires would decide to fight over Ohio, of all places, is forever truly a bit of a mystery. But that is exactly what happened. There's kind of this trade war ongoing over furs. A lot of French residents in Michigan and some of the indigenous people in Michigan would go down and fight in Ohio. They would bungle the entire affair. It would spark a global war. This global war is called the 7 Years' War, and it would determine the fate of North America. The war doesn't go very well for Britain at first, but by 1759, the British have seized Quebec, and Quebec is that bottleneck to all of Michigan and all of the Great Lakes. And once the British have seized that city after a great big victory, they would take over Michigan, and that's how Michigan comes into British hands. The native people don't necessarily love that. There is a rebellion in the 1760s. The British are able to put that down. That's its own whole story, but it's very expensive to send all these troops over here, so they, of course, have to raise taxes on things like tea and the Stamp Act, and we wind up in the American Revolution, right? We're moving through these things really fast to get back to some more shipwrecks and a little bit about Michigan history. Michigan actually stays quite loyal during the American Revolution. They simply, paid their taxes like good residents, like good citizens do. Here's some rebel propaganda with that Paul Revere and the Boston Massacre. But we, of course, lead to independence and then lots of battles, right? It's the 250th anniversary this year and next year and the few years after that of the American Revolution. But suffice to say, the United States would win, they'd become their own country, and there was still very little going on here in Michigan other than this fur trade. And when it came to shipping, there were just a couple of small sloops that had been built, so very few ships to actually wreck until the very end of the 18th century. So that's why we don't see a whole lot of galleons or anything like that on the bottom of the Great Lakes. Just these small fur trading posts that had operated primarily on canoes. I always like mentioning it's right around this time, the beginning of the 19th century, all of Detroit would burn down. It's kind of I think, a landmark part of Michigan history, and they decided it was such an important area, they decided to rebuild. And that actually appears on Detroit's flag. You can see the fire back there in 1805, caused by careless bakers when they were pulling out the coals from their oven. That would spread everywhere. But again, this fur trade would continue well into the 19th century, all the way up until 1812. And that's one of those years in American history that we all associate, of course, with the War of 1812. So here we see, we owe allegiance to no crown. They would spark a war with the United Kingdom in 1812. The United States would declare war, and Michigan would become the seat of that war. And so we're getting into my next shipwreck, because the next shipwreck is actually some warships, which I think is really something interesting when you think about it. We've been blessed with 200 years of peace here in Michigan. We don't think about a lot of fighting or being on the front lines of war, but we sure were. The plan was Michigan was going to, the United States was going to invade Canada from Michigan, from New York, from up in Maine. It did not go well. The plan was that Canada would greet us as liberators. It was not the first or last time that was said in American history. Never really worked out very well. Hull has to surrender Detroit almost immediately, and the White House gets burned down. But the one place the United States did really well in the War of 1812 was navally on the Great Lakes. Because remember, both Great Britain and the United States are constrained by Niagara Falls. Great Britain has this enormous navy. I read a statistic once that always stuck with me, that at the beginning of the War of 1812, the U.S. Navy was very, very small. For every single cannon in the United States Navy, the Royal Navy had an entire ship. We were very much outclassed. But because you're limited by where you can build these ships on the Great Lakes, this was one area we could kind of have a relative parity with the British. So both sides got onto a shipbuilding spree. There's the Battle of Lake Erie. This is Oliver Hazard Perry. Don't give up the ship. He moves from the Lawrence to the Niagara, and we soundly beat the British at sea, but on the Great Lakes, an inland sea. So the ships I want to talk about as a specific wreck that really illustrate the War of 1812 are two of my favorite shipwrecks. It's the USS Hamilton and the USS Scourge, both of which were built as small little sloops. So they were little tiny ships that were mostly used to transport goods on the Great Lakes, thinking they're mostly going to be used there on the Great Lakes. Here's the Hamilton and the Scourge in August of 1813. We're heading out of New York, and they were heading here into Lake Ontario. They're just north of, you've got St. Catharines down here, Niagara on the lake right here. This is the river. They were heading out this way to join a convoy, and the Hamilton had actually been a captured British ship right at the very beginning of the war. They had showed up as this transport ship on the American side. Customs kept them under wraps, and then when war was declared, they immediately seized the ship and armed it and put a couple cannons on board. And so neither of these were exactly very sturdy vessels. They weren't incredibly stout, and they certainly weren't built for war, but they were used for it. And when they were sailing out, each one had a crew of close to 50 men on these tiny little ships. And they ran into a huge summer squall, and the rain came pouring down. And in the middle of the night, in this big storm, each ship began taking on more water than they could get off. With most of the crew below decks, they both floundered in the sea and sank right in the middle of this huge summer storm. And 82 men went down, only 16 survivors, and it was mostly the crew who were up in the rigging, who were on watch, who were able to get into something that they could float with. And that's the last anyone had heard of the Scourge and the Hamilton until the 1970s, when a fisherman was out and he had his fish finder, and lo and behold, he went over something. He's like, what is this? I'm finding something on the bottom. Maybe it's a shipwreck. They brought back a little bit more accurate sonar, and boy, what a find, right, to see that on your sonar when you're looking for a shipwreck. These ships were in amazing condition. They're two of the most well-preserved shipwrecks because of the fresh water and where they sit. They hadn't really been disturbed because they just floundered. They just kind of settled very gently onto the floor of the lake, just like how they would sit up on top of the lake. So here's one of those figureheads. Here's another great picture just to show you. I mean, the mast still standing straight up. Really looks like if you pump the water out, that's something that would float back up. It was such a terrible tragedy. You know, one of the things that we think about is Michigan has this amazing sailing culture today. I believe one of my favorite hometown facts about Port Huron, St. Clair County for a while had the highest per capita boat registrations of any county in the entire United States. And that's beating places like Florida, where it's warm year-round. The lake's frozen half the year up here, but everybody owns a boat. We have this amazing sailing tradition. But if you think about those situations back in 1812, there were very few sailors in Michigan. Most of the guys on this boat were highly inexperienced. Where are you going to get sailing tradition? Where are you going to get sailing work if there are no sails on the Great Lakes? There's no sailing ships. So they were very new at this, very sad to have lost them. But here you can see even the cannons still ready for action. A few of them kind of knocked over a little bit there. Now, the HMS, the Hamilton, had actually originally been named the Nelson for Lord Horatio Nelson, the hero of Trafalgar, who had been killed back in 1805. So that jaunty little man there is Captain Nelson there on the front, but the British didn't want a British, or the Americans did not want a British war hero on the front of their ship. So it is a war grave today. Those ships are very well protected. In fact, they're actually owned now by the city of Hamilton, Ontario, and it requires a lot of oversight to dive on those or to get any kind of the information out of them. Like many of the Great Lakes wrecks, they are a grave, and especially when they are a war grave for U.S. veterans who are on there, they're very highly protected. So a lot of these guys have newer headstones on land that are commemorated for their loss back in 1813. But very interesting to me to think that there are warships on the bottom of the Great Lakes. Not something we think a whole lot about today. But it does tell you, Michigan's been through war. It's seen some fighting. There were even battles on places like Mackinac Island. So there was active fighting here in the state of Michigan. The good old U.S. Navy came up and bombarded the back of the island here. It was kind of not to much effect, but at the very end of the war, we really come in clutch with our diplomats. They agree to what's called status quo antebellum, the way it was before the war. And so all of Michigan is returned back to the United States and would remain ever since. So in the last 200 years, one of the biggest changes in the history of seagoing vessels comes from this guy, who's not from Michigan, but he's a pretty integral figure. You can actually see his invention in the background here, because this is, of course, Mr. Fulton. Robert Fulton invented the steamship. They called it Fulton's Folly. Nobody thought it was a good idea to put a steam engine on a boat. It seemed very dangerous to have a big fire on a wooden boat. But being able to self-propel yourself with a big paddle, and this kind of looks a little ungainly, but it was a prototype, turned out to be pretty amazing. You didn't need the wind to push you around. You could sail directly against the wind. This would cause a revolution in what we saw in ship history. And so Michigan's very first sailing vessel came just a few years after the invention of the steamboat, and that was walk in the water. And walk in the water just goes to show you how quickly Michigan would change in the decade of the 1820s, so about 200 years ago. Because 200 years ago this year is the history of this major project. This is the Erie Canal, right? 16 miles on the Erie Canal. This was a water connection from the Hudson River over to Lake Erie. So all of a sudden, Niagara Falls, which has been this major problem for trade on the Great Lakes, they've gotten rid of this. And the population of Michigan was going to explode because of this increased naval connection onto the Great Lakes. It was a huge land boom about 200 years ago. In fact, there were attempts to even build further canals. One of my favorite attempts, they were going to build a canal all the way across the state of Michigan to go all the way from Mount Clemens and Lake St. Clair all the way to Lake Michigan in a little place called Singapore, which, if you know anything about ghost town, Singapore is completely buried underneath some sand dunes over on the west side of the state. They didn't get very far. In fact, this became pretty economically not very viable very quickly, but it just goes to show you how quickly we went from just a few fur traders to having tens of thousands of people moving into the area who wanted to begin farming Michigan's rich fertile land. And once you have all these people here, there's an explosion in shipbuilding. We see lighthouses begin to pop up because all of a sudden we go from hundreds of years where there are very few sailing vessels to one where there are now hundreds of sailing vessels being built essentially every year. And Walk in the Water is one of these big landmarks because we get one of the newest, latest pieces of technology very quickly because its utility was seen right away on the Great Lakes. Now, what happened to Walk in the Water? It's actually our second of our, or third, however you want to count it. It's one of our next major shipwrecks to talk about. Walk in the Water would actually wind up in November of 1821. She was only in operation for about 3.5 years. She was heading back to Buffalo from Detroit, having brought over a large number of people and supplies. They were always kind of a mixed cargo ship. So they weren't just cargo, they weren't just passengers. So on the way back, there are about 120 people on board, and they're heading into Buffalo, and they run into a huge storm. And Lake Erie, although it is the shallow Great Lake, can have really bad storms because it's kind of like a bathtub. You get a lot of wind or some high barometric pressure, it can blow the water one side or another and really smash you about. So that's the problem they had. The huge storm comes up, so they decide to wait it out. They drop down both anchors. As they're waiting in the storm, one of the anchor chains breaks. They kind of feel the ship lurch to one side, so that's not good. Now there's even more pressure on the remaining anchor chain, and it too would snap. And now they have no anchors at all. They're completely at the mercy of the waves, at Mother Nature, and everyone's very scared by this. Everyone comes up on deck. No one wants to be below decks in a situation like that, especially when you think about just how dark it was. Everyone was trying to find the Buffalo lighthouse that would signal at least where the city was, where they could try and point a direction to, or if they had to get in a lifeboat, where to start paddling towards. No one could see anything. It was pitch black. We really don't appreciate just how dark the past truly was without electric light. And so pitch black, huge storm, and all of a sudden everyone on board hears this mighty as the entire ship heaved up onto ground. People didn't know if they were on a sandbar or a rock or what. Somebody looked out with a lantern, lo and behold, he saw some grass. They knew they had landed on some solid land. And almost everyone jumps off immediately. About 10 minutes later, they realize the ship has grounded itself up on the beach somewhere. They're still not exactly sure where. Another enormous wave would come in, crest over the back of the ship, and smash it to smithereens. Almost every single rib broke off of the keel. There was nothing left of this ship, destroyed by the storm in one night. They began walking. They found they were less than a mile away from the lighthouse, but it goes to show you just how weak the light was at the time and just how violent this particular storm was. So what would happen to Walk in the Water? Well, they certainly weren't going to rebuild it, but the most valuable part was, of course, that steam engine. That was very, very expensive to put on one of those, and they actually decided to repurpose it. They dragged it a couple hundred yards inland, found a better spot, and then they hooked up the engine. Instead of paddling those paddle wheels, they hooked it up to a sawmill. And the very first thing they did to power it, they fed all of the bits and pieces and debris from the ship. They just fed it into the fire to power that sawmill. And kept making money, just in a way they didn't expect. So the very first steamship on the Great Lakes didn't have a long career, but certainly an interesting one. So we jump forward a little bit further in time. We can see this is a lot more akin to what we think of as a modern boat. This is the SS Pewabic. The Pewabic, I think, is a great story. The Pewabic was operating on the Great Lakes for quite a while. But by the 1860s, she would have her destiny with fate in August of 1865. Now, the Pewabic had a sister ship called the Meteor, and these two ships would operate in tandem with each other. So one would leave Detroit, heading all the way up into Lake Superior, over towards Houghton, and they would head up towards Copper Harbor and Eagle Harbor, and a number of different destinations up in the Keweenaw. And when one was leaving Detroit, the other would be leaving the Keweenaw. And they would just keep flip-flopping throughout the summer and throughout the shipping season. They would always pass each other, typically off of Alpena, is about where they found each other going in opposite directions. And they had a long-standing tradition that the ship that was coming up from Detroit, they'd have the latest mail, newspapers, magazines, and the ship coming back from the Keweenaw, well, the Keweenaw might as well have been the dark side of the moon. It was very cut off from the rest of the state, the rest of the country. The people up there were always starved for that newspaper, magazine, any kind of thing that they could get from downstate. And so when they'd pass by, the ship coming up from Detroit would take that big bag and bundle of newspapers, they'd pass so close by they'd heave it from one ship to another, and the other ship would catch it, and they would have kind of a little party. It was a tradition they had. Probably won't surprise you how this ship sank. So in August of 1865, they're getting ready to pass by each other, and as they're doing this, they get a little off in their calculations, and the meteor would wind up, the meteor's heading up from Detroit, the Puwabic's heading back from the Keweenaw, the meteor would slam into the side of the meteor, ripping a huge hole. She'd sink in just 15 minutes. She'd take about 125 souls with her. We actually don't even know the full number, the extent of the damage, because all of the logbooks were completely destroyed in that wreck when she went down so quickly. Even with another ship right there at the scene of the sinking, they couldn't get too many lifeboats out. It sank just so fast. But the Puwabic tells us a lot. It's a really interesting wreck because she was essentially a package freighter. So she carries lots of different cargo as well as passengers, and the cargo wasn't just bulk one thing or another. It could have a number of different products. You could see everything from China and silverware, but there was one product in particular that Puwabic carried a lot of. What was she bringing back from the Keweenaw? Not iron, not yet. Copper. So even before they were harvesting a lot of the iron that they would find in the UP, the Keweenaw is famous for its copper. And it's some of the purest, best grade copper, easiest to get anywhere in the world. It's the largest find of that raw, pure copper anywhere in the world. And I think this bears a story about Michigan history that's worth telling, because how did Michigan even get the Upper Peninsula? Why is the Keweenaw in Michigan, the same place as Detroit? So this is the Old Northwest. This area becomes part of the United States at the end of the American Revolution. They have a plan to divide it up into some new states, and states that would eventually become Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota and Illinois, right? So they call this the Old Northwest because at the time, that was the most northwest part of the whole country. So how did Michigan wind up getting Toledo? Simple. Or how did we get the Upper Peninsula? We traded Toledo for it. It's the Toledo War. And I think it's one of the most fascinating aspects of Michigan history. So maps of Michigan, we all generally know what Michigan looks like, but some maps have been better than others. And when they were drawing out the lines between these brand new states, they had a couple of different ways to divide them up. One of the key ones was that the bottom of Lake Michigan was going to form the border between whatever that state, what is going to be the territory of Michigan, and the territory of Indiana and Ohio. Ohio became a state first because they're the furthest to the east. They got their population threshold first, and they'd become a state all the way back in 1803. And according to their borders that they sent to Congress in 1803, you draw a line from the bottom of Lake Michigan over here. That's going to be that northern border of Ohio and Michigan. Later on, when Indiana would join, they actually moved where that line was so they would get a little bit of access to the lake. But Ohio, which had been a state since 1803, wasn't really too much of a problem when they set this border, because at the time, this entire area here, most of the population of Ohio was living in the east. This whole area of northwest Ohio was a giant morass. They call it the Great Black Swamp. Almost no one lived there. Indigenous people didn't really go there. It was an uninhabitable wasteland. Some things do not change a whole lot. And so this terrible swampland, they didn't really care exactly where the line was. And it didn't come until the 1830s when Michigan was ready to become a state that it actually became pretty important, because they realized, when they went back to their maps, they realized Ohio used a deliberately old and bad map to claim that the border should be right here, further, about 30 miles further to the north than where it really should be. But that means they would get the mouth of the Maumee River and the important city of Toledo. And so that was economically pretty valuable to Ohio. But again, they're just kind of cheating to do this. They're kind of purposely using some pretty bad geographic information to make that major claim. So the territorial governor of Michigan at the time is a guy named Stevens T. Mason. He is just 19 years old. He would be the youngest governor, not only of Michigan, but of any state in the history of the country. And Stevens T. Mason would deploy the state, or the territorial militia. We were not a state yet. We had filled out all of the paperwork, we met all the qualifications, but the last thing they had to settle was this border issue. And so the territory of Michigan passed something called the Pains and Penalties Act. and they would fine anyone who was caught paying taxes to Ohio in Toledo, and they would actually send the Michigan Territorial Militia to occupy the city. So they would send these brave and gallant boys down to occupy the city, make sure that peace was maintained, and remind them all, hey, Toledo is in Michigan. Now, there was bloodshed in this war. We call it the Toledo War. Blood was shed. This is actually an interesting grave. They sent down, since Toledo would be in Monroe County, they sent down the sheriff of Monroe. And he was at kind of a rowdy tavern meeting where there were many people who were pro-Ohio, many who were pro-Michigan. He was trying to keep the peace. And at one point, he turns on his back on someone from Ohio, and that someone was Mr. 2 Stickney. So Stickney's dad was a guy named Benjamin. Benjamin had 3 kids. It was 1 Stickney, 2 Stickney, and 3 Stickney. He numbered his children. It's what you get from Ohio, right? So 2 Stickney would actually stab the sheriff of Monroe County with a penknife in the back, leading to some bloodshed. Fortunately, he survived. He wasn't killed by that, but Mr. Stickney's real. In fact, anytime you go through Toledo, you'll see the exit for Stickney Avenue right on 75. I always think of Mr. 2 Stickney whenever I see that, spilling Michigan blood over the city of Toledo. Now, the governor of Ohio is very concerned, right? He claims Toledo is part of Ohio, and so he wants to maybe dispatch the Ohio State Militia. And there could be some widespread bloodshed. Now, the governor of Ohio is a guy by the name of Governor Lucas. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you, Scout's honor, I have not altered in any way. I just want you to think very briefly, tiny tangent. If you're getting your portrait painted, this is not something you do overnight, right? This is something not instant like a photo. I think we've all lived through the indignity of like getting a bad picture of us taken for a yearbook or a driver's license or something, and you hate that. So you figure when somebody is painting your portrait over days and days, you'd have some input on that. You're going to want to make sure it looks nice. You're going to see what that looks like. The governor of Ohio went with this as his official state portrait. So clearly evil, right? I don't think any questions there. Was very good friends with Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, being the president at the time, put his thumb on the scale for Ohio. And so as a result, there's a great quote from John Quincy Adams: "Never in the course of my life have I known a controversy of which all the right so clearly on one side and all the power so overwhelmingly on the other." So Andrew Jackson would step in to try and settle this issue, and what they eventually came up with was they would let Ohio steal Toledo from Michigan, but as a consolation prize, Michigan got the entire Upper Peninsula. So who thinks we came out on the better side of that deal? Who still wants Toledo? Because I think we should just get both. That's me. There's actually one other fun thing that you can think of every time you see this. This is the state seal of the state of Michigan. You know, you see it up on the flag, things like that. It's on all the official documents. So we applied for statehood in 1835. This whole Toledo rigmarole took about a year and a half. It's why we became a state in January of 1837. But if you're really good at Roman numerals, I know it's cut off a little bit here on the bottom. We have MDCCC XXXV. We put the 1835 date for our statehood on the state seal. So we said, that's when it should have been. We're counting from there. But we get this huge peninsula. We get this whole territory that was considered a barren wilderness. They would send people like Douglas Houghton up there, who would immediately discover that it was one of the most mineral-rich places in the entire world. In fact, more money would be made on the copper extracted from the Upper Peninsula than all of the gold in the California gold rush in the 1840s. So we really did get a lot of money from that. And that copper, as I mentioned, was incredibly pure. To bring this back to the Puabic, that was carrying thousands and tens of thousands of ingots of this very pure copper that went down in a couple hundred feet of water off of Alpena. It was just sitting there, so valuable. And salvagers just couldn't salvage anything that deep at the time, back in the 1860s. And by the 19-teens, there was a guy named Benjamin Leavitt who invented the hard hat diving suit. So like the Scooby-Doo diving suit that you have to have a crane lower you in. He invented this entire apparatus with the express purpose of diving on the Puabic to salvage that copper because it was worth millions and millions of dollars. We have that copper from that shipwreck and a whole field of fancy diving equipment because of that value here on the bottom of the Great Lakes in Lake Huron. So that's a pretty cool story. You know, technologically, of course, we've talked about the 1860s, the Civil War, ships would change a lot. They get iron plating. The very first iron-hulled ship on the Great Lakes is the SS Merchant. The merchant here, not too impressive, not much to look at here. In October of 1875, she'd run into Racine Reef off of Wisconsin, and everyone got off. No one died in that wreck. The worst that happened, I imagine that captain had some explaining to do when he got back to the office and perhaps had to start looking at the classifieds, I would imagine. But the very first iron-hulled ship of Michigan has that kind of indignity. But the cool story is the first steel-hulled ship. Now, the very first steel-hulled ship, not only in the state of Michigan, but anywhere in the world, was built here in Michigan. It was built in Wyandotte. There was a large steel manufacturing industry in the 1870s already in Michigan, enough so that a smaller ship like a tugboat they could make out of steel. And so this was the Tug Sport. And the Tug Sport would ply the waters around here for close to 50 years. The Tug Sport, as I mentioned, was built in Wyandotte by Eber Brock Ward, one of Michigan's first millionaires. So he would be a shipping magnate, make a ton of money. In the 1870s, the 1880s, and 1890s, Michigan's waters were still full of schooners, these big, three-masted ships that required kind of a skeleton crew and no fuel costs, right? If the wind's blowing you, you don't have to be shoveling coal into a furnace somewhere or a boiler. And so the tugboats had their work cut out for them throughout the end of the 19th century and early into the 20th century as well. But Michigan had this burgeoning industry because, anybody know, what was the big business in Detroit before cars? Anybody know? Stoves, yeah. So cast iron, cast steel, there was a lot of metalworking going on around Detroit. This was, anybody ever go see this one? This was at the old state fairgrounds. Sadly, this, it's kind of ironic, it burned down. Even though it's supposed to be a cast iron stove, the big one was made out of wood, got hit by lightning and burned down. But there was all of this industry already set up in Michigan to make things like the Tug Sport. That's where that steel could come from. Well, the Tug Sport would operate all the way until 1920. And in 1920, she was still working, had a little bit of an engine upgrade, but she was headed out of Port Huron, north into Lake Huron. And as she was heading up, it was a small crew, but one of the stokers, so the guy who's feeding the coal into the boiler to make sure they have all the steam pressure they need, takes ill. Something doesn't set well with his stomach, and he goes to bed. The problem is he doesn't tell anyone, and the fire dies out in the boiler, and no one was paying attention to it. So all of a sudden, the boat's going slower and slower and slower, and the bilge pumps aren't keeping up. There's always a little bit of water coming into your ship. As long as you can pump it out faster and it comes in, you're fine. But if you lose that steam pressure, the ability to run those pumps, you're going to be in a problem in a hurry. And they try and restart the fire, but it's too late. There's a little bit of a wind picking up. And so right off of Lexington is where she starts to have her problems, but she can make it all the way to Port Sanilac before it's just taken on way too much water in December 1920. Everyone gets in the lifeboat, and they're only just a couple of miles off of shore when she finally settles too deep in the water. They get in the lifeboat. No one is killed, and the ship would rest down just in a few feet of water just off of Port Sanilac. Now, as kind of an aside, you guys probably all like history. You're here to history lecture. How many of you are familiar with those big green historical markers they have in the state? I always thought if I were, a millionaire, a billionaire, the idle rich, one of the things I would love to do is see every single one of those historical markers in the state. I think that'd be a worthwhile endeavor. Well, let me tell you, if you share that dream of mine and you want to do that, one of the things you have to factor into your plan is you do have to take scuba lessons, because at the site of the sport, it is the only underwater historical monument in, I believe, the country, certainly in the state of Michigan. There's one of those green markers, and it marks the Tug Sport, which is in just a few feet of water. The Tug, because of that excellent steel hull, is in great shape, and it's readily accessible to casual divers. So lots of people go check out the Tug Sport. If you're ever diving off of Port Sanilac, that's one of the things that you can go and see. So we're up to the 20th century now, right? So we're getting closer and closer to current day. One thing, we're talking about shipwrecks. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the November of 1913 storm, creatively called the Storm of 1913. This is the largest storm in the recorded history of the Great Lakes, an amazingly huge storm. It was a combination of a couple storms. There was some water that was coming up from the southwest. It was very, very kind of hot, or at least warm and damp. So the kind of, think like the snowfall that, just piles up and it's wet and it's slush. And then there was an Alberta clipper was coming in from Canada, incredibly cold and incredibly fast winds. These two storms would meet and converge over the Great Lakes. And believe it or not, you can actually have a hurricane on the Great Lakes, and that's what this was. This is one of those things of history I have no interest in seeing. I would never go in a time machine. This would be terrifying to see. A hurricane, a big spinning storm directly over the Great Lakes. And in fact, this storm would kind of spin. It would send a lot of the wind straight down Lake Huron. And you get this opportunity without anything to break up those waves. The wave height would build and build and build and build until you got to the very bottom of Lake Huron. And they talk about, it's easy to see when you look at where the casualties were on this storm. You can see, a few up here as it's blowing down this way, and then a huge chunk in this line straight down that way, because you get this enormous wave height. The lighthouse keeper at Fort Gratiot in Port Huron, this guy by the name of Kimball, the Fort Gratiot lighthouse is 86 feet tall. And he said, standing up in the lantern room, the waves were crashing 40 feet up on the lighthouse. If anybody's ever been to the lighthouse there, you know you are yards and yards and yards from where the water just naturally edges today. To think about waves coming all the way up to the lighthouse is one thing. To think about waves coming all the way up and crashing halfway up is apocalyptic. You can't imagine what a big storm that was. He said if the storm had continued for even another single hour, the entire tower would have collapsed. But dozens of ships were grounded, dozens more lost. This is the largest single incident of a large number of ships going down. One of the amazing things, I'll have to update this slide, they actually finally have announced they have found the James Carruthers just a couple of weeks ago. Anybody paying attention to that or maybe saw that across their news feed? They finally found all of the ships from the storm of 1913. But these were not small freighters by any stretch of the imagination. Many were grounded where they were simply blown up on shore. If you were lucky, that's what happened. Many of the others were making their way up into the lake, trying to turn around when they encountered this huge storm that kind of came out of nowhere. People were really surprised by it. Some, like this one, would actually flip over in the water, and this was in sight of the lighthouse, in sight of Port Huron, and people did not know what ship this was. They said, what could that be? That was the mystery ship for a few days. They actually had to dispatch a diver to go out and read the letters on the bottom of the ship to see what ship is this. If you can imagine the forces at play to take a 500-foot-long freighter and flip it over like a toy boat, that's a pretty powerful storm. They found it was the Charles S. Price. So that was a huge deal and killed hundreds of people, at least 275, probably closer to 300 in this massive storm back in November of 1913. Our next shipwreck is just a couple of years later, but under very different circumstances. This is the SS Eastland. Who here has ever heard of the Eastland before? Just a couple of people. It's never really that surprising, but it's always a little surprising to me that the Eastland story just isn't out there. I actually do an entire lecture just on the Eastland because it is such a fascinating tale. Now, remember earlier we talked about the Titanic? Why did so many people die in the Titanic? Not enough lifeboats, right? That's pretty easy explanation. When not enough room in the lifeboats, people go into the water, and how puny is mankind? You never see the iceberg blamed as much as man's hubris. But yeah, you wind up into this very cold water, not enough lifeboats on board. They're doing the best they can with what they have. What do you think the very first law they passed after the Titanic sank was? Yeah, have more lifeboats, right? Everyone committed to having more of these lifeboats. That's exactly what would happen to the Eastland. The Eastland was built in 1903 in Port Huron at the Jenks Shipbuilding Yard. She was built for the South Haven steamship line. She'd go from South Haven to Chicago. And she was a pleasure craft. That's a big change from all the ships we've been talking about have been very industrial. This was more of like an excursion vessel, something you go and actually just have fun on. And they'd take in fresh fruit, fresh milk from South Haven, take it into Chicago, head back, just a couple of hours in either direction. And so the ship was built in Port Huron. It was exceptionally narrow of a ship, so she could actually navigate her way out of the Black River in Port Huron and the Black River over in South Haven. They also have one over there. And so when the Titanic sinks, they make some additional modifications. They add even more lifeboats right up on top, so there are enough lifeboats for all of the passengers on board. Now, in July of 1915, the Western Electric Company would charter the Eastland and a number of other vessels to go to their company picnic. They were heading over, follow me, to the Hawthorne picnic. And they were heading from the Hawthorne plant, which implied 45,000 workers, and they were going to go from there over to Michigan City, Indiana for a fun, casual day. This is back before the age of unions, the 8-hour workday, or weekends, or anything like that. Basically, that's going to be your vacations. They'll close the whole factory one day, and you can take it or leave it, and there's your trip. And so about 8,000 people were excited to go on this picnic. 2,500 passengers lined up that morning. They got on board the Eastland, which was the legally allowed number. There were enough lifeboats for 2,500 passengers. Everyone gets on board, and as the ship was at dock, as they're getting ready to leave, in the Chicago River in downtown Chicago, the ship would begin listing from port to starboard, and eventually the list would become so extreme, water would start pouring over the port side, and she would flip completely onto her side, winding up with a situation not too dissimilar from the Poseidon adventure, where some people were able to simply step off to the side of the boat. Those who were on the far river side were trapped below decks in just 19 feet of water. The ship was only 38 feet across, so she's sitting on her side on the bottom of the river. Of the 2,500 passengers on board, 844 would drown. More passengers would drown aboard the Eastland than passengers perished on the Titanic. And this is something that virtually no one has heard of today. There's a lot of reasons for it, but and it happened in just 19 feet of water in the summer in the middle of the city, in the middle of Chicago. This was a horrific maritime disaster that so few people have heard of today. They would eventually raise the Eastland and try and figure out exactly what went wrong, but in a twist worthy of, the great science fiction show The Twilight Zone, what do you think caused the wreck? One of the biggest factors, all of those lifeboats they had added on top. Upset the balance of the ship. It already had a very high metacentric center of gravity. They add all those lifeboats, and that's the straw that breaks the camel's back. So you add them to save lives, and it causes the accident that kills all those people. They would, in fact, chop off all of those upper decks and all of those lifeboats. By 1917, the United States had entered World War I, and the Illinois Naval Reserve needed a new training ship. So they purchased it, they outfitted it with a couple of 4-inch deck guns, and that's the USS Willamette, which would see service well into the 1940s, late 40s, I think, if they finally scrapped her. But pretty amazing to think that it's the same ship. As kind of an aside, while we're talking about shipwrecks on the Great Lakes, the Willamette actually sunk a U-boat on the Great Lakes. There's actually a U-boat on the bottom of Lake Michigan that a lot of people don't realize. It was actually one that, it wasn't prowling shipping lanes or anything like that. It was actually one we had captured from the Germans. It was on tour around the Great Lakes to show off and sell war bonds, but as per the Treaty of Versailles that we signed, we were obligated to destroy it. And they were getting ready to send it to a scrapyard, and then one of the gunners aboard the Willamette said, hey, I got an idea I want to pitch. We could scrap it, but I have a way more fun way we could get rid of that U-boat. And so they towed it out and used it for target practice. And so there is a U-boat on the bottom of Lake Michigan. But going back to the Willamette, as I mentioned, or going back to the Eastland, it's a whole new way of how we treat the Great Lakes. Michigan had really grown. We see all sorts of pleasure craft rather than just this heavy, heavy industry like we think of before. There are cruise liners. There are cruise liners on the Great Lakes today. Today, there are more pleasure craft on the lakes than just about anything else. But we do, of course, still have our freighters. And by the 1920s, we've entered kind of the modern era of freighters that we still see today. This is the SS Senator, sunk on Halloween of 1929. Took down 7 souls with her. The Senator was a largely unexceptional ship, nothing all that exciting about a freighter, very typical of her build from the 19-teens with a small steam engine, not an enormous ship. She'd crash in a very typical way. She ran out into the fog and 16 miles northeast of Port Washington, about 400 feet of water in Lake Michigan, right off of Milwaukee. She would collide with the Cleveland Cliffs ship Marquette. They'd crash in heavy fog in the shipping lanes, and the Cleveland Cliffs ship would slam right into her side, cut a big gash in the side. She'd take on a ton of water and go down. So why are we talking about this largely, unknown wreck, unexceptional? I think it, again, can inform us about Michigan history because of what one of the pieces of cargo was aboard the Senator. What was she carrying? Cars. Yeah, she actually had 268 Nash automobiles from the factory in Kenosha. that tells us a lot about how much Michigan's economy had changed. Now, I know Kenosha's in Wisconsin. That's a Wisconsin company. Go on to be part of AMC and with Nash. But it tells you that by the 1920s, Michigan is motor capital of the world, and the Great Lakes to a lesser extent. And the fact that they're shipping hundreds of these cars, they aren't just kind of a fun toy for the idle rich anymore. Places like Flint have truly become vehicle city. We have the moving assembly line. We have people that I don't even need to tell you their name because they're household figures even to this day, hundreds of years on. There's Mr. Ford going from his first car to his 10 millionth car, and they'd build 5 more million of them after this with these Model Ts. The entire shipping industry would change and become dominated by places like the Rouge plant. These large factories around the Great Lakes would really change the extent of our shipping on the Great Lakes. Now, I don't want to make anyone show hands, but we're up to, if that's the Mackinac Bridge, that's within living memory of many people who are still alive today, can remember a time before the Mackinac Bridge. And I want to talk about the Cedarville. The Cedarville is one of these other freighters that frequently would haul taconite to be made into things like cars or other major production items down in Detroit and the major Midwestern cities. The Cedarville would go down in 1965, taking 10 men with her. And just like the SS Senator before, sank in an entirely not uncommon way. She was hit by the Topdelsfjord. Another freighter would slam into her in the heavy fog. But Topdelsfjord, that's an interesting name. What that tells us is it's a Norwegian ship. What's a Norwegian ship doing on the Great Lakes? Finally, in 1959, just 1 year after the Mackinac Bridge would open, they would open the St. Lawrence Seaway. And finally, that dream that we talked about all the way back to the beginning of the presentation, boats could come in from the ocean, they'd head all the way through the series of locks. They can avoid Niagara Falls and come directly onto the Great Lakes and back out. So you all of a sudden have European vessels that can use these locks. We have salties that make their way onto the Great Lakes. We see ships from like Hong Kong here on the Great Lakes. It fundamentally, once again, changes the economic game here in Michigan. There was heavy fog underneath the Mackinac Bridge when the Topdelsfjord would slam into the Cedarville. Topdelsfjord was okay. She needed some welding work on her bow, but created another huge gash into the side of the Cedarville. She began taking on a lot of water. The engineer said, all right, at first they made plans to go to Rogers City. There was a number of dry docks there where they could have people check it out, make sure that they could seal up any damage that was done. They realized that as the ship began to list, they were taking on more water than they had initially thought. So then the plan was, well, let's go to Sheboygan. It doesn't really have the facilities we need, but this is a little more serious. A couple more minutes go by. The engineer realizes they're taking on even more water. He says, we don't have time to make it to Sheboygan. Aim for Mackinac City. We have to get off the boat right now. We're going down. And that's what would happen. She would go down in the Straits of Mackinac, the bitterly cold May water. Even though it's the spring, that's cold, cold water in the Straits of Mackinac. And it would be exposure that would do some of those men in who are exposed to that. And the Cedarville would wind up on her side at the bottom of the Straits as part of the Shipwreck Preserve that's up there in the Straits of Mackinac. What's astounding to me is now we have crossed another threshold. This is a popular spot for people to go down and see some of the many dozens of shipwrecks on the bottom of the Straits of Mackinac. More men have died diving the shipwreck than died in the initial shipwreck itself. So 11 men have died diving the wreck. 10 went down with it the day she sank back in 1965. But the Mackinac Bridge, it's one of these amazing Michigan monuments that's tied into this accident. Construction started back in the early 50s, 1954. They were looking back as late as the 1930s, and there were some people with visions back in the 19th century of enormous bridge to tie our two peninsulas together. It was always very difficult to get back and forth between the upper and lower peninsula. They had to use big car ferries like this that were popular. The city of Sheboygan, people would begin lining up, especially this time of year. You'd see all the deer hunters making their way up and back down with deer tied. Some people talked about lines that would go all the way back to Sheboygan, waiting to go up into the upper peninsula on one of these deer hunting expeditions. So people were so excited when the bridge would finally open in November of 1957. They very wisely decided to wait to have their official ribbon cutting in June of 1958, because it's a lot more fun to have a party in June than November up in Mackinac. And so they would open it in June of 58, and here we have 83 58 Oldsmobiles. There are 83 of them because there was a beauty queen from every single county in the state. How's that for pageantry, to come across and open the bridge, elbow, elbow, wrist, wrist, right? So pretty amazing. So we've come nearly to the very end of our lecture, but I have to tell you, I am legally obligated to talk about one more shipwreck, and which one would that be? The Fitz, right? We are now 50 years on from the sinking of the Fitz, and there's going to be a lot of commemoration of this and a lot of memory of this particular shipwreck. The Fitz, when she was built in 1958, the same year the bridge was completed, was the queen of the lakes, the largest of all of the ships, 730 feet long. So she would start out as the longest on the Great Lakes. She would not end her career as the longest because other freighters began being lengthened to a full 1,000 foot as they made for longer locks in the Sioux. But she was making one of those trips. She was actually coming over here from some mills in Superior. She was making her way, not fully loaded for Cleveland, as the song sings, but to Zug Island, which maybe is harder to rhyme, I don't know. But there are some liberties in the song. We got to address that. The reason everyone knows about the Fitz is the song, right? It is such a, that song is such a banger that they're listening to it 50 years on. It was such a powerful and evocative song. It's very, very popular. And Gordon Lightfoot is really the reason we talk about this wreck and not any of these others. There have been deadlier wrecks. There have been more recent wrecks. There have been other ones. This one is, in many ways, a good stand-in for a lot of the wrecks that we see. It was very late in the season. They're always pushing for, one more trip for the season, and the gales of November came early. Not necessarily, though. There's always huge storms in the fall, and Lake Superior is a scary place. So making for Whitefish Bay, the lighthouse there, actually, the weather was so bad that night, it knocked out the power at the lighthouse and swamped the backup generators. So she had no light to guide on. And some people say maybe that would have made some kind of difference because the Fitz was having a lot of trouble with her radar. Couldn't see things. She was relying on the Arthur Anderson to help her. I found this model one time, and this, of course, shows Whitefish Point and the Fitz sinking there. My friend Bruce is the director up at Whitefish Point, and I asked Bruce, I said, is this to scale? And he had to tell me that no, the Fitz did not sink like 15 feet off the shore. It was a little further out than that. But exactly what happened to the Fitz is still a bit of a mystery. It's one of those other things that is very, very popular. There's a lot of number of theories. They have done a number of dives. They found it, of course, split in half on the bottom. But there are a number of ways that the Great Lakes can really do a lot of damage to some of these huge multi-hundred foot long freighters. You can simply get swamped by a huge wave. One of the parts of the song that I don't necessarily think, it's very evocative, like, fellas, it's too rough to feed you. You think about the ship, sloshing from side to side. The waves were coming at her from the back. And so she probably wasn't doing a whole lot of listing one way or another. But you could get swamped by one particularly big wave. Maybe there were some of those rogue waves that are reported that comes, like the Three Sister waves that would wipe things over. Or those hatch covers weren't battened down all the way, which seems like likely the case. They found a lot of them that were not buckled up on the wreck. That more of that water is soaking into the taconite. The taconite takes on that extra weight. You're already sitting a little bit lower in the water. And then all of a sudden it takes one big wave where you wind up on a crest and you can kind of crack one of those in half without too much difficulty. 26,000 tons of iron ore will sink you right to the bottom very, very fast. So one of the things we know about this wreck is the Arthur Anderson was helping her with their radar. They're watching on the radar screen as it's sweeping around. They're seeing all the other ships, and it's there on one sweep. And the last thing that they had said was, we're holding our own. Nobody had reported any extreme difficulties. They said, a few more miles behind us, right? They'll make Whitefish Bay. That's true. They were very closing in on relative safety of Whitefish Bay. So they said they're making their own. There was no general, call to abandon ship or we're listing or taking on water. None of that. And all of a sudden on the radar, she's there, and then boom, she's gone. Not there anymore. So something happened very quickly for none of those men to get off, none of those men to try and launch a lifeboat or even put out a call for distress. Their radios certainly worked, even if their radar did not. But they have dove on that. They've found that. They've actually made there's quite a few laws regarding diving it as a grave site. It is one of the most protected shipwrecks because of its fame. You don't want people heading down there being treasure hunters or anything like that. There are a number of people who've talked about trying to make requests on the Canadian government to get back in there to do more research, to maybe try and help ascertain again more evidence for exactly what failures led to the loss of the Fitz. But at the end of the day, in some ways, it doesn't really matter. There were a number of things that went wrong. We know just how dangerous the lakes can be. And this wasn't all that long ago. Ships like the Arthur Anderson, she's still out there. I think she's laid up in Toledo this particular season, but she's still around. I saw her, last year was still an active freighter. We're still in living memory for a lot of people to remember this just 50 years ago. It's sad we've lost Gordon Lightfoot. He didn't make the 50th anniversary. He died just a couple of years ago, but his song is what really propelled this and the thought of the Great Lakes and all the shipping that goes on it into the popular public consciousness. So we kind of end with the question, that really does take us up to the modern day of, will there be another shipwreck? And the answer is almost certainly yes. We certainly don't hope for it, but it's hubris to think that there won't be. We even see things like last year, the Cuyahoga had a big crack in the side. They had to go and take her and eventually cut her up. There are accidents can happen. Negligence certainly happens. Human greed. These are all the things that kind of can cause major shipwrecks. There's less ships operating on the Great Lakes today than there have been at any point in the 20th century, just because they're bigger and the need is a little bit less for them. But they always try and build in those safety standards. Think of all the advances that have been made in the last 50 years. But again, it's hubris to think that there wouldn't ever be another accident. It's hopefully that the planning and safety is there, that there won't be another major loss of life on that. But it also shows you just how far we came from those canoes in the history of the state of Michigan, right? Thinking about that evolution from fur trade to light industry, all the way to heavy industry to our economy today, and people enjoying the lakes is just a beautiful place to go out and sail on. So I hope that you've learned at least a little bit about some of these shipwrecks, at least something fun about our cool state. It's a survey, right? We're flying over at 30,000 feet. And I want to thank you for coming along with me on that trip. Again, my name is Andrew Kercher. My email address is andrewlkercher@gmail.com. And my website, it's real easy to remember, is kercher.info, I-N-F-O. I've really enjoyed speaking here at Livonia. I hope I'll get the opportunity to come back. So if anybody sees a talk here or on my website that you're particularly interested in, you can always put in a request with a local librarian, or check out the website. I speak all over the state, and it's something I really enjoy doing. And I'll, of course, stick around to answer some questions afterwards. But thank you guys so much for spending part of your evening with me. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that you did too.